7. Eva. One time during the holidays, I visited the house where, years before, Demian had lived with his mother. An old woman was strolling in the garden. I spoke to her and learned that the house belonged to her. I inquired after the Demian family. She remembered them very well, but she did not know where they lived at present. Sensing my interest in them, she took me into the house, looked out a leather album, and showed me a photograph of Demian's mother. I could hardly remember her, but now that I had the small photograph before me, my heart stood still. It was the picture of my dreams. There she was, the tall, almost masculine figure, looking like her son, but with maternal traits of severity and deep passion, beautiful and alluring, beautiful and unapproachable, demon and mother, fate and lover. There was no mistaking her. The discovery that my dream image existed on this earth affected me like some fantastic miracle. So there was a woman who looked like that, who bore the features of my destiny. Where was she? Where? And she was Demian's mother. Shortly after this, I embarked on my journey, a strange journey. I travelled restlessly from place to place, following every impulse, always searching for this woman. There were days when everyone I met reminded me of her, echoed her, resembled her, enticed me along the alleys in strange cities, railway stations, trains, like a confused dream. There were other days when I saw how futile my search was. Then I would sit idly somewhere in a park, a hotel garden, a waiting room, look into myself and endeavour to bring life back to the image within me. But I had now become shy and evanescent. I was unable to sleep. I had to be satisfied with cat naps on railway journeys through unknown landscapes. Once, a woman in Zurich followed me. She was a pretty, somewhat impudent creature. I hardly looked at her, but continued on my way as if she were made of air. I would have rather died then and there than pay attention to any other woman, even for an hour. I felt that my fate was drawing me on. I felt that the moment of fulfillment was approaching, and I was mad with impatience at not being able to do anything about it. Once in a station, I think it was Innsbruck, I caught sight of a woman who reminded me of Eva. She was seated by the window in a train that was just starting, and I was miserable for days. And suddenly the form reappeared in a dream one night. I woke up feeling humiliated and dejected by the futility of my hunt, and made my way back home. A few weeks later I was enrolled as a member of the University of H. I found everything disappointing. The course of lectures on the history of philosophy, which I attended, was as uninspired and stereotyped as the activities of the undergraduates. They were all so much to pattern. Everybody behaved in an identical way, and the animated gaiety on their boyish faces looked empty and artificial. But I was free. I had the whole day to myself. I lived in peace and comfort in a tumble-down house just outside the town, and had a few volumes of Nietzsche on my table. I lived with him, felt the loneliness of his soul, shared his prescience of the fate that drove him unceasingly on, suffered with him, and rejoiced that there had been one man who had relentlessly followed his destiny. Late one evening I was strolling through the town. An autumn wind was blowing, and I could hear members of student clubs singing in the taverns. Clouds of tobacco smoke came from the open windows with a profusion of songs, loud, solemn, yet uninspired and uniformly dead. I stood at the street corner listening as this punctually rehearsed gaiety of youth rang out in the night from the two inns. Community spirit everywhere, sitting about together everywhere escape from fate and flight to cosy firesides. Two men were walking slowly behind me. I caught a snatch of their conversation. "Isn't it just like the young men's house in a Negro village?" said one. "Everything's the same down to the tattooing which is now in fashion. Look, there you have young Europe." The voice sounded amazingly familiar. I'd heard it before. I followed the two of them along the dark lane. One was Japanese, small and elegant. I could see his smiling yellow face gleaming under a street lamp. The other was now speaking again. "I don't suppose it's any better with you in Japan. The people who don't make a beeline for the fireside are rare the whole world over. There are some here too." I felt a mixture of joy and alarm as each word he said went through me. I knew the speaker. It was Demian. I followed him and the Japanese through the gusty night, along the dark lanes, listened to their conversation, and Demian's voice was as music in my ear. It had the familiar ring, the familiar assurance and calm and all his old power over me. Everything was set to rights again. I had found him. When they arrived at the end of a street in the suburbs, the Japanese took his leave and opened the door of a house. Demian retraced his steps. I had stood still, waiting for him in the middle of the street. My heart beat fast as I saw him coming towards me, with his springy tread and upright carriage. He was wearing a fawn mackintosh, and a thin walking stick dangled from his arm. He came on without any change in his uniform pace, until they had practically reached me. Then he removed his hat, and I obtained a clearer view of the familiar, intelligent face, with the determined mouth and the peculiar radiance of his broad forehead. "Demian!" I called out. He stretched his hand out towards me. "So it's you, Sinclair. I've been expecting you." "Did you know I was here then?" "Not exactly, but I certainly hoped you were. I didn't see you until tonight. You've been on our tracks the whole time." "Did you recognize me straight away then?" "Of course. You've changed, naturally, but you still have the mark on you." "The mark? What sort of mark?" "In the old days we called it the mark of Cain, if you still remember. It's our sign. You've always had it. That's how I became your friend. But it's more evident now." "I wasn't aware of that. But on second thoughts, yes, I was. Once I painted a picture of you, Demian, and I was astonished to find that it resembled me." "Was that the mark?" "Yes, that was it." "Good. Now you've understood. My mother will be pleased too." This frightened me. "Your mother? Is she here? But she doesn't know me." "She knows about you. She will recognize you without my having to tell her who you are. You've kept us without news of you for a long time." "I often wanted to write, but I couldn't. For some time now I have felt in my bones that I must soon find you. I've been waiting for that every day." He thrust his arm under mine and walked along with me. An atmosphere of calm surrounded him, which infected me. We were soon chatting as we used to in the old days. Our thoughts went back to our time at school, the confirmation classes, also the more unfortunate period in the holidays. Only now our conversation was confined to our earliest and closest relationship, and the Franz Kromer business was not mentioned. Without noticing it, we had got on to strange and mysterious topics. We talked, like an echo of Demian's exchanges of views with his Japanese friend, of student life, and other things that seemed a far cry from that, and yet there was a fundamental and inner unity of idea behind everything Demian said. He spoke of the spirit of Europe and the signs of the times. On all sides, he said, we were seeing the reign of cooperation and the herd instinct, love and freedom nowhere. All this communal spirit from student club and glee club to the same spirit in government was an inevitable development. It was community life based on anxiety, fear, and opportunism. Within, it was an outworn and indolent way of life approaching its collapse. "Communal spirit," said Demian, "is a fine thing, but what we now see flourishing everywhere is not really that. The real spirit will rise up, new, from the separate contribution of each individual, and for a time it will transform the world. The only manifestation of communal spirit to be seen at present is the herd instinct at work. Human beings fly into each other's arms because they are afraid of each other. The masters are afraid for themselves. They are a community composed entirely for themselves. And why are they afraid? Man is only afraid when he is not attuned to himself. They are afraid because they have never made themselves known to themselves. They are a community composed entirely of men who are afraid of the unknown element within themselves. They are all conscious of the fact that the laws of life they have inherited are no longer valid, that they are living according to archaic tablets of the law, that neither their religion nor customs are adapted to our present-day needs. For 100 years or so, Europe has done nothing but study and build factories. They know exactly how many grams of explosive are needed to kill a man, but they do not know how to pray to God. They do not even know how to remain happy and contented for one single hour. Just look at a students' club like this, or indeed any place of amusement where rich people congregate. Hopeless. My dear Sinclair, nothing encouraging can emerge from that kind of thing. These men who come together in this nervous fashion are riddled with fear and evil. None of them trust each other. They cling to ideals which no longer exist, and stone anyone who sets up a new one. I have a presentiment that great divisions lie ahead. They will come, believe me, and come soon. Naturally, they will not improve the world. Whether the workers murder the manufacturers, or the Russians and Germans shoot each other, it will merely be a change of ownership. But it won't have been in vain. It will show up the bankruptcy of the present-day ideal. There will be a sweeping away of Stone Age gods. This world, as it is now constituted, will perish, will be destroyed. It's happening before our eyes. And what will become of us in the meantime? I asked. Us? Perhaps we will be destroyed with it, but even that does not absolve us from responsibility. Around whatever remains of us, or around those of us who survive the catastrophe, will gather the spirit of the future. The will of humanity which this Europe of ours, with its science and industry fairs, has shouted down for a time, will be revealed. It will then become clear that the will of humanity is never and nowhere to be identified with that of our present communities, states and nations, clubs and churches. No. What nature wants of man is written in a few individuals, in you, in me. It was written in Christ. It was written in Nietzsche. Only for these important currents alone, which can of course assume a different form every day, will there be a place when the communities of today collapse. It was late when we stopped in front of a garden by the river. "This is where we live," said Demian. "Come and visit us soon. We want to see you very much." Full of elation, I retraced my long way back through the now chilly night air. Here and there noisy students were reeling home through the town. I had often marked the contrast between their comic kind of merriment and my solitary life, sometimes with scorn, sometimes with a feeling of deprivation. But never until today had I realized with calm and quiet confidence how little it mattered to me, and how remote and dead all that world now was for me. I called to mind the civil servants in my own town, worthy old gentlemen who clung to the memories of their drunken university days as if they were memories of a blessed paradise, and upon the vanished freedom of their student years built a cult similar to that which poets or other romantics formerly devoted to childhood. Was it everywhere alike? It was always somewhere in the past that they looked for freedom and happiness, out of sheer dread lest they should be reminded of their own responsibilities and their own future course. They drank and made merry for a few years, then they crawled into their shells and became serious-minded men in the service of the state. Yes, it was indolence, the spirit of indolence among us, and the student's stupidity at least was not so stupid and evil as countless other stupidities. By the time I had arrived at my distant home and was preparing for bed, all these thoughts had vanished, and the whole of my mind was focused expectantly on the great hope which the day had brought me. I was to be allowed to see Demian's mother as soon as I wished. Tomorrow. The students could hold their drunken celebrations, tattoo their faces. The world could be indulgent and wait for its destruction for all I cared. I was only waiting for one thing, for my fate to approach me in a new guise. I slept hard until late in the morning. The new day dawned like a solemn feast day of the kind I had not experienced since boyhood. I was full of great restlessness, but devoid of any sort of fear. I felt that an important day had dawned for me. I saw and experienced a changed world around me, expectant, meaningful and solemn. Even the gentle autumn rain had its beauty, and a calm festive air full of happy, sacred music. For the first time, the outer world was perfectly attuned to the world within me, as when it is a special day for the heart, and one feels that it is blessed to be alive. No house, no shop window, no face disturbed me in the street. Everything was as it should be, without any of the flat and humdrum look of the everyday, ready and expectant to face its destiny with reverence. It was how the world had appeared to me, a small boy on the mornings of the big feast days, Christmas and Easter. I had forgotten that the world could still be so lovely. I had grown accustomed to my inner life, resigned to the fact that I had lost my feeling for the outside world, and that the loss of its bright colours was an inseparable part of the loss of childhood, and that one must to some extent pay for the freedom and maturity of the soul with the renunciation of those pure gleams of light. But now, entranced, I saw that all this had only been clouded over, and that it was still possible, as a liberated person and renouncer of childhood happiness, to see the world shine and savour the delicious thrill of the child's vision. A moment came when I found my way back to the garden on the outskirts of the town, where I had taken my leave of Max Demian that night. Hidden behind high walls and mist-grey trees stood a little house, bright and homely. Tall plants grew behind a high glass wall, Behind glistening windows were dark walls with pictures and bookshelves. The front door led straight into a small heated hall, and a silent, dark-skinned old maidservant, with a white apron, showed me in and took my coat. She left me alone in the hall. I looked around me and was immediately swept into the middle of my dream, for high up on the dark-panelled wall, above a door, hung a familiar picture in a black frame. It was my bird, with the golden-yellow sparrowhawk's head, struggling out of its terrestrial shell. Taken aback, I stood there motionless. In my heart were mixed feelings of joy and pain, as if that moment everything I had done and experienced before was coming back to me in the form of a reply and a fulfillment. I saw a host of pictures flashing past my mind's eye. The house at home with the old coat of arms above the door arch. The boy Demian sketching the carving. Myself as a boy, terribly involved in the evil spell of my enemy Cromer. Myself an adolescent, in my schoolroom by the table, quietly painting the bird of my desire. My soul lost in the intricacy of its own threads. And everything up to the present moment found a new echo in me, was corroborated, answered, approved. With eyes moistened with tears, I gazed at my painting, absorbed in my reflection. Then my glance dropped. Under the picture of the bird in the open door stood a tall woman in a dark dress. It was she. I was unable to utter a word. From a face that resembled her son's, timeless and ageless, and full of inward strength, the beautiful, dignified woman gave me a friendly smile. Her gaze was fulfillment, her greeting a homecoming. Silently I stretched out my hands towards her. She took them both in her warm, firm hands. "You are Sinclair. I recognized you at once. Welcome." Her voice was deep and warm. I drank it up like sweet wine. And now I looked up and into her quiet face, the black, unfathomable eyes, at her fresh, ripe lips, the open, queenly brow that bore the sign. "How glad I am," I said, and kissed her hands. "I believe I've been on my way here the whole of my life, and now I've reached home at last." She gave a motherly smile. "One never reaches home," she said amiably, "but wherever friendly paths intersect, the whole world looks like home for a time." She was expressing what I had felt on my way to her. Her voice and even her words were like her son's, yet at the same time quite different. Everything about her was riper, warmer, more assured. But just as Max in the old days had never given the impression of being a boy, his mother did not look like the mother of a grown-up son. So young and charming was the aura that surrounded her face and her hair. So firm and smooth her fair skin, so fresh her lips. More regal even than in my dreams, she stood before me, and this closeness was bliss, her gaze fulfillment. This, then, was the new form in which my fate was to reveal itself, no longer stern, no longer setting me apart, but fresh and cheerful. I made no resolutions, took no vows. I had attained my goal, the high point from which the continuing path was revealed, distant and attractive, climbing to the promised land, shaded by treetops of approaching happiness, cooled by nearby gardens of every joy. Whatever might happen to me, I was blessed in my knowledge that this woman was in the world, that I could drink in her voice and breathe her presence. If she could only become a mother to me, a lover, a goddess, if she could just be here, if only my path could be close to hers. She pointed up to my sparrowhawk picture. "You never gave Max more pleasure than with this picture," she said reflectively, "and me too. We've been expecting you. When the painting came, we knew that you were on your way to us. When you were a small boy, Sinclair, my son came back home from school one day and said, 'There's a boy there who has a mark on his forehead. I must have him for my friend.' It was you. You've not had an easy time, but we had confidence in you. You came across Max again when you were at home on holiday. You were about 16 years old. Max told me about it." I interrupted. "He told you that? That was the most miserable period of my life." "Yes," Max said to me, "Sinclair has his worst time coming now. He's making another attempt to take refuge among the others. He's even become a pub crawler. But he won't be successful. His mark is momentarily obscured, but it sears him secretly underneath." "Isn't that true?" "Oh, yeah, it's exactly like that. Then I discovered Beatrice, and then at last a guide came to me. He was called Pistorius. Only then did it become clear why my boyhood had been so closely bound up with Demian, and why I could not escape from him. Dear Eva, dear mother, I often thought I should have to take my own life. Is the way as difficult as this for everybody? She caressed my hair with her hand. It felt as light as a breeze. It is always difficult to be born. You know the bird did not find it easy to struggle out of the egg. Think back and ask yourself, was the way so hard then? Wasn't it beautiful too? Could you have wished a more beautiful or easier path? I shook my head. It was hard, I said as if I were asleep. It was hard until the dream came. She nodded and looked right into me. Yes, you must find your dream, then the way becomes easy. But no dream lasts. Each dream releases a new one, and you should not wish to cling fast to any particular one. I was profoundly shaken. Was that a warning note already? Was that a defensive move already? But it was all one. I was prepared to allow myself to be guided by her, and not inquire about the goal. I do not know, I said, how long my dream will last. I wish it could be eternal. My fate has received me under the picture of the bird like a mother, and like a lover. I belong to it and nothing else. Well, the dream is your fate, and as long as you remain faithful to it, she confirmed in serious tones. I was overcome by a sudden sadness, and a longing to die in that enchanted hour. I felt my tears, what an infinity of time since I last wept, well unceasingly in my eyes, and I could not restrain them. I turned violently on my heel, walked to the window and gazed into the distance, beyond the plant pots with tear-blinded eyes. I heard a voice behind me. It was calm and yet as brimming with tenderness as a wine-filled beaker. Sinclair, you're a child. Your fate loves you indeed. One day it will be wholly yours, as you dream it will be, if you remain constant to it. I had regained my self-control and I turned my face towards her again. She gave me her hand. I have a few friends, she said smiling, just a handful of very close friends who call me Frau Eva. You shall be one of them if you wish. She led me to the door, opened it, and indicated the garden. You will find Max out there. I stood dazed and shaken under the tall trees. I did not know whether I was more awake or more in a dream than ever. The rain dripped gently from the branches. Slowly I walked out into the garden which bordered the river. Finally, I found Demian. He was standing in an open summer house, stripped to the waist, and was doing some boxing practice with a suspended sandbag. I stopped, amazed. Demian looked strikingly handsome with his broad chest and firm manly head. The raised arms with taut muscles were large and powerful. The movements came from the hips, shoulders and arms like gushing springs. Demian, I called, what are you doing here? He gave a cheerful laugh. Practicing. I've promised a little Jap a boxing match. He's as agile as a kitten, and just as full of tricks, of course. But he won't pull it off with me. It is a slight act of abasement that I owe him. He drew on his shirt and jacket. You've just been with Mother, I suppose? He asked. Yes, Demian, and what a wonderful mother you have. Frau Eva. The name suits her admirably. She's like a universal mother. He looked into my face thoughtfully for a moment. So you know her name already? You may well be proud, my lad. You're the first person she told it to in the first hour of meeting. From this day on, I went in and out of their house like a son and brother, and a lover too. When I closed the door behind me, or rather as soon as I saw the tall trees in the garden rise up, I felt rich and happy. Outside was reality. Outside were streets and houses, human beings, institutions, libraries and classrooms. But here was love and soul. This was the home of dream and legend. And yet we lived in no way cut off from the outside world. We often lived in the midst of it, in our thoughts and discussions, but on different ground. We were not divided off from the majority of men by boundaries, but by another kind of vision. It was our function to represent an island in the world, a kind of prototype perhaps, to proclaim in our lives new potentialities by our way of living. I, who had been a solitary so long, learned about the companionship which is possible between human beings who have tasted utter and complete loneliness. I no longer hankered after the tables of the fortunate, nor the feasts of the blessed. I was no longer affected by envy or nostalgia when I watched the community life of others. And slowly I was initiated into the secret of those who bear the sign on their brow. We who bore the sign might rightly be considered awed by the world, even mad and dangerous. We were awake, or awakening, and our striving was directed at an ever-increasing wakefulness, whereas the striving and quest for happiness of the rest was aimed at identifying their thoughts, ideals, duties, their lives and fortunes, more and more closely with that of the herd. That too was striving, that too was power and greatness. But whereas we, in our conception, represented the will of nature to renew itself, to individualize and march forward, the others lived in the desire for the perpetuation of things as they are. For them, humanity, which they loved as we did, was something complete that must be maintained and protected. For us, humanity was a distant goal towards which we were marching, whose image no one yet knew, whose laws were nowhere written down. Apart from Frau Eva, Max and myself, many seekers of a very varied kind were closely, or in a more general way, attached to our circle. Many of them followed particular paths, had chosen special aims, put their faith in specific ideas and duties. They included astrologers, Kabbalists, and a disciple of Count Tolstoy, and all manner of sensitive, shy, vulnerable men, members of new sects, devotees of Indian practices, vegetarians, and so forth. With all these, we had no common spiritual bond, save the respect which each of us accorded the secret ideal of the other. Those who were concerned with man's pursuit of gods and new ideals in the past were closer to us. Their preoccupations often reminded me of those of Pistorius. They brought books with them, translated texts of ancient tongues to us, showed us illustrations of ancient symbols and rites, and taught us to see how the whole possession of humanity so far consisted of ideals that emanated from the unconscious soul, dreams in which humanity groped after the vague notions they had of their future potentialities. Thus we made our way through the wonderful, thousand-headed throng of the gods of the ancient world up to the dawn of the Christian conversion. We learned about the creeds of solitary saints and the changes of religion among different races. And from everything we collected in this way, we gained a critical understanding of our time and contemporary Europe, which with prodigious efforts had created new weapons for mankind, but had ended by falling into a deep and final desolation of the spirit. For it had conquered the whole world, only to lose its own soul in the process. The circle also included believers and adherents of particular hopes and faiths. There were Buddhists who were eager to convert Europe, disciples of Tolstoy and other sects. We, who were more intimate together, felt no anxiety about the shape the future was to take. Every sect, every faith, seemed dead already and of no use. The only duty and destiny we acknowledged was that each one of us should become so completely himself, so utterly faithful to the active seed of nature within him, and live in accordance with it, that the unknown future should find us prepared and ready for whatever it might bring forth. For expressed or unexpressed, this was clear in our minds, that a new birth and a collapse of the present time was imminent and already discernible. Demian often said to me, "What will come is beyond our powers of imagination. The soul of Europe is an animal which lay fettered for an infinitely long time. When it becomes free, its first impulses will not be the most agreeable. But the ways, straight or crooked, are unimportant provided the real need of the soul, which we have so long and continually drugged and led on false trails, finally comes to light. Then our day will dawn. Then we shall be needed, not as leaders or new lawgivers. We shall not survive to see the new laws, but rather as men of good will, and, as such, ready to go forth and stand prepared wherever fate may need us. Look how all men are ready to accomplish the incredible, once their ideals are threatened. But there is no one there when a new ideal, a new and perhaps dangerous and secret stirring of new life, is knocking at the door. We shall be the handful of people who are there, ready to move forward. That is why we are branded, as Cain was, to rouse fear and hatred, and drive men out of their unimaginative idyll into more dangerous ways. All men who have striven for the progress of humanity, all of them without exception, were capable and effective only because they were ready to accept their fate. It is true of Moses and Buddha. It is true of Napoleon and Bismarck. What particular movement one serves, what pole one is directed from, are matters outside one's own choice. If Bismarck had understood the Social Democrats, and had imposed himself upon them, he would have been a shrewd fellow, but hardly a man of destiny. The same applies to Napoleon, Caesar, Loyola, all of them in fact. They must understand their situation biologically and historically. When the upheavals of the earth's surface cast the creatures of the sea on the land, and land creatures into the sea, the predestined specimens of the various orders were there ready to follow their destiny and accomplish the new and fantastic, and by making new biological adjustments were able to save their species from destruction. We do not know whether these were the same specimens who had previously distinguished themselves among their species as staunch, conservative upholders of the status quo, or rather as eccentrics and revolutionaries. But we do know that they were ready, and could therefore lead their species into the new phase of evolution. Therefore we too intend to be ready. Frau Eva was often present during these discussions, but she herself did not join in. She was a listener, and an echo of each one of us as we explained our thoughts, full of confidence and understanding. It seemed as if all our ideas emanated from her and went back to her in the end. It was bliss for me to sit close to her, hear her voice sometimes, and share the rich and inspiring atmosphere that surrounded her. She was immediately aware of any unhappiness or new development within me. I gained the impression that the dreams I had at night were inspired by her. I often recounted them to her, and she found them comprehensible and natural. They held no mysteries which she could not grasp intuitively. For a time my dreams followed the pattern of our daytime conversations. I dreamed that the whole world was in a turmoil, and that by myself or with Demian I was tensely waiting for the fateful moment. The figure of destiny was veiled but had the features of Frau Eva. To be chosen or rejected by her, that was fate. Often enough she said with a smile, "Your dream is not yet complete, Sinclair. You have forgotten the best part." And then that part would come back to me and I could not understand how I'd come to forget it. At times I was restless and tortured by desire. I thought I could no longer bear her to have her near me without taking her in my arms. She soon became aware of this. When on one occasion I absented myself for several days, and then returned in a state of distress, she took me aside and said, "You must not give way to desires which you do not believe in. I know what you want. You should, however, either be capable of renouncing those desires, or feel wholly justified in having them. If you are once able to make your request in such a way that you are certain that the fulfillment exists within yourself, then sooner or later the fulfillment will come. But at present you are first wishing, then regretting, and full of apprehension. All that must be overcome. Let me tell you a story." And she told me about a youth who had fallen in love with a star. He stood by the sea, stretched out his arms and prayed to the star, dreamed of it, made it the object of all his thoughts. But he knew, or thought he knew, that a star could not be embraced by a mortal being. He considered it to be his fate to love a star without any hope of fulfillment. And on this conception he founded a poetic philosophy of renunciation, torment and silent suffering that would refine and cleanse him. But all his dreams were directed to the star. Once he stood on the high cliff at night by the sea, and contemplated the star and burned with love for it. And in moments of great longing, he leaped into space towards the star. But just as he leaped, the thought flashed through him, "This is impossible." There he lay on the shore, shattered. He had not understood how to love. If at the moment of jumping he had possessed a sure and steadfast faith in the fulfillment of his love, he would have soared into the air and have been united with the star. "Love must not entreat," she added, "nor demand. Love must have the power to find its own way to certainty. Then it ceases merely to be attracted and begins to attract. Your love, Sinclair, is attracted by me. When it begins to attract me, I will come. I will not bestow a gift. I must be one." Another time she told me another story. It concerned a lover whose love was unrequited. He withdrew into his heart and thought his love would consume him. For him the world seemed lost. He no longer saw the blue heaven and the green forest. The brook no longer murmured. He took no pleasure in the sound of the harp. Nothing mattered any more, and he had become poor and wretched. But his love increased, and he would have welcomed ruin and death rather than renounce possession of this beautiful woman with whom he was infatuated. Then he felt that this passion had burned up everything else inside him, and it became so strong and magnetic that the beautiful woman was compelled to follow. She came, and he stood with outstretched arms, ready to draw her to him. As she stood before him, she was completely transformed, and he saw that he had won back all he had previously lost. She stood before him and surrendered herself to him, and the sky, forest, and stream all moved back towards him in new and resplendent colours, and spoke to him in his own language. And instead of winning a woman, he had the whole world in his heart, and every star in heaven glowed in him, and joy coursed through his being. He had loved, and by so doing had found himself. My love for Eva seemed to me to fill my whole life. But every day she looked different. On many occasions I believed that it was not really just her as a person, whom I yearned for with all my being, but that she existed as an outward symbol of my inner self, and her sole purpose was to lead me more deeply into myself. The things she said often sounded like replies from my unconscious mind to burning questions which tormented me. There were other moments when, as I sat beside her, I was consumed with sensual desire, and kissed objects which she had touched. And little by little, sensual and transcendental love, reality and symbol, mingled together. As I thought about her in my room at home in tranquil absorption, I felt her hand in mine, and her lips touching my lips. Or I would be conscious of her presence, look into her face, speak with her, and hear her voice, not knowing whether she was real or a dream. I began to realize how one can be possessed of a lasting and immortal love. I would gain knowledge of a new religion from my reading, and it would give me the same feeling as a kiss from Eva. She stroked my hair and smiled with all her warm affection, and I had the same feeling as when I took a step forward in knowledge of my inner self. Her person embraced everything that was significant and fateful for me. She could be transformed into each one of my thoughts, and each of my thoughts could be transformed into her. I'd been apprehensive about the Christmas vacation which I spent at my parents' home, because I thought it was bound to be torture to be away from Eva for 2 whole weeks. But it did not turn out like that. It was wonderful to be at home, and yet be able to think of her. When I arrived back at H, I stayed away from her for 2 days in order to savour the security and independence from her physical presence. I had dreams too in which my union with her was consummated in a symbolic act. She was a star, and I was a star on my way to her, and we met and mutually attracted, remained together and circled round each other blissfully in all eternity, to the accompaniment of the music of the spheres. I told her this dream on my first visit on returning. "It is a lovely dream," she said quietly. "Make it true." There was a day in early spring that I have never forgotten. I entered the hall. A window was open and a sly current of air wafted the heavy scent of hyacinths through the room. As no one was about, I went upstairs to Max Demian's study. I tapped lightly on the door and, as was my custom, went in without waiting for a reply. The room was dark and all the curtains were drawn. The door stood open into a small adjoining room where Max had set up a chemical laboratory. From it came the clear white light of the spring sun, which shone through the rain clouds. I thought that there was no one in, and drew back one of the curtains. Then I saw Max Demian huddled on a stool by the curtained window, looking strangely different, and it flashed through me that I had already experienced this moment in the past. His arms hung limp, his hands were supported on his knees. His head was slightly bowed over them, and his eyes, though open, were unseeing and dead. The pupils reflected a thin thread of light as if they were fragments of glass. His livid face was hollow and expressed nothing but a terrible fixity. He resembled one of those age-old animal masks on a temple gateway. He did not appear to be breathing. Memory took charge. I had seen him looking exactly like that once before, many years ago, when I was just a small boy. His eyes had been turned inward in just that way. His hands lay lifeless together. A fly had crawled over his face. And on that occasion, it might have been 6 years before, he had looked like this, old and timeless. No line in his face today showed any change. Overcome with fear, I quietly left the room and hurried downstairs. I met Eva in the hall. She was pale and seemed tired in a way I had never known her to be before. And just then a shadow passed over the window and the white, dazzling sun suddenly vanished. "I've been with Max," I whispered gently. "Has anything happened? He's asleep or drugged, I don't know which. I saw him look like that once before." "You didn't wake him up, did you?" she asked quietly. "No, he didn't hear me. I left the room straight away. Tell me, Frau Eva, what is wrong with him?" Don't worry, Sinclair, nothing is wrong. He has withdrawn into himself. It will soon pass. She stood up and went out into the garden, although it was beginning to rain. I felt that she did not want me to accompany her, so I walked up and down the hall, inhaled the overpowering scent of the hyacinths, stared at my bird picture above the door, and breathed the strange atmosphere of oppressiveness which filled the house that morning. What was it? What had happened? Frau Eva returned before long. Beads of rain were suspended in her dark hair. She sat down in her armchair. She seemed weary. I approached her, bent over her head, and kissed the raindrops out of her hair. Her eyes were bright and calm, but the drops tasted like tears. "Shall I have a look at him?" I whispered. She gave a weak smile. "Don't be a child, Sinclair," she admonished, as if she was trying to break a spell in herself. "Go off now and come back later. I can't talk to you just now." I hurriedly left the house and town and walked in the direction of the mountains, with the fine rain slanting against me. Low clouds swept by as if they were weighed down with fear. Near the ground there was hardly a breath of wind, but a storm seemed to be blowing in higher altitudes. Several times the sun, white and dazzling, momentarily broke through rifts in the steely clouds. Then a more attractive yellow cloud passed over the sky, piled itself against the other grey bank of cloud, and in a few seconds the wind fashioned a shape out of the yellow and blue-grey mass, a gigantic bird that tore itself free from the steel-blue chaos and flew off into the sky with great beats of its wings. Then a storm became audible, and a mixture of hail and rain rattled down. There was a brief, unbelievable and terrifying crack of thunder over the rain-lashed landscape, and immediately afterwards a gleam of sunshine burst through, and on the nearby mountains the pale snow shone livid and unreal above the brown forest. When, hours later, I returned wet through and buffeted by the wind, Demian himself opened the door to me. He took me up into his room. A gas jet was burning in the laboratory, and papers were strewn about the floor. He had evidently been working. "Sit down," he invited. "You must be exhausted. It was a ghastly storm. It must have been hard going for you out there. There's some tea coming up." "There's something odd about today," I began hesitantly. "It isn't only this bit of a storm." He gave me a searching look. "Did you see anything?" "Yes. I saw a picture in the clouds, quite clearly for a moment." "What kind of a picture?" "A bird." "The sparrowhawk, was it? The bird of your dreams?" "Yes, it was my sparrowhawk, huge and yellow, and it flew off into the steel blue sky." Demian heaved a great sigh. There was a knock. The old servant maid brought in the tea. "Help yourself, Sinclair. I don't believe it was just chance that you saw the bird." "Chance? Does one see things like that by chance?" "Quite right. No, it means something. Do you know what?" "No, I only feel that it portends a world convulsion of some kind, a move on the part of destiny, something I believe concerns us all." He paced up and down. "A move on the part of destiny," he shouted. "I dreamed the same kind of thing last night, and Mother had a premonition yesterday, which conveyed the same message. I dreamed I was climbing up a ladder placed against a tree trunk or tower. When I had reached the top, I saw the whole landscape ablaze, a vast plain with its towns and villages. I can't yet remember it all. It is still somewhat confused." "Does the dream have any personal message for you?" I asked. "Of course. No one dreams anything that doesn't concern himself. But it doesn't only concern me. You're quite right. I am pretty accurate in separating the dreams which affect my own soul from the others, rare in all conscience, in which the whole destiny of the human race is involved. I have rarely had such dreams, and never before of one of which I could say that it was a prophecy which was fulfilled. The interpretations are too uncertain. But I know for sure that I've dreamed something that doesn't concern me alone. The dream is linked up with other previous dreams I've had, and which it continues. It was those dreams which caused me the forebodings I spoke to you about before. That our world is desperately indolent we know, but that would be insufficient reason to prophesy its destruction. But for several years I've dreamed dreams which make me feel that the collapse of an old world is imminent. At first these were vague, remote presentiments, but they've become increasingly strong and unambiguous. I still know nothing more, except that something is going to happen on a vast scale, something terrible in which I personally shall be involved. Sinclair, we shall survive whatever this thing is that we have discussed so often. The whole world will be renewed. There's a smell of death in the air. Nothing new arises without death. But it is more terrible than I supposed. I stared at him aghast. "Can't you tell me the rest of your dream?" I ventured to ask him. He shook his head. "No." The door opened and Frau Eva entered. "So you're sitting here together? You're not feeling sad, children, I hope?" She looked fresh, all trace of tiredness had vanished. Demian smiled at her and she came up to us like a mother approaching her frightened children. "Not sad, Mother. We've merely been trying to solve the enigma of these new omens. But it doesn't matter. Whatever is to happen will happen suddenly. It will suddenly be there, and then we shall learn whatever we need to know." But I felt depressed. And when I took my leave and walked alone across the hall, the scent of the hyacinths seemed faded, insipid and corpse-like. A shadow had fallen over us.